Hello, and welcome to the Full Scottish on this, the 15th of September. This is Broadcasting Scotland's review of the headlines of the past week. I'm Douglas MacKenzie, and to discuss the stories behind the headlines with me, welcome two guests today. The first is Sandra White, who's retired former SP for Glasgow Kelvin, and whose political experience is such that it would probably be quicker for me to mention the committees she didn't serve on in the Scottish Parliament than the ones that she did. Long serving contributor to the programme, so welcome, Sandra.
Thank you, Douglas.
And my other guest is Paul McLennan, serving MSP for East Lothian since 2021, and also Housing Minister in the current government. So welcome, Paul.
Good afternoon, Douglas.
Yes, I always start this with good morning, and you're right, it's afternoon now. So we start the programme, as we always do, with the update from Ukraine on this day 935 since the full-scale Russian invasion of the country. More than 100 Ukrainian prisoners of war will be able to return to their families after an exchange of captives of the Russian and Ukrainian armed forces. The swap on Saturday, mediated by the United Arab Emirates, involved 206 military personnel from both countries. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said of the 103 Ukrainian warriors who were released, 82 were soldiers and privates, and 21 were officers, including police officers and border guards. In return for their freedom, Ukraine released more than 100 Russian military personnel taken prisoner in the Kursk border region since Ukrainian forces occupied. It is the second such swap since Ukraine's incursion into Russia and occurred after mediated negotiations. Russian shelling killed at least 7 people in 4 attacks on the south, southeast, and east of Ukraine on Saturday, regional Ukrainian governors said. The UK and the US have raised fears that Russia has shared nuclear secrets with Iran in return for Tehran supplying Moscow with ballistic missiles to bomb Ukraine. During the summit in Washington, D.C. on Friday, Keir Starmer and Joe Biden acknowledged that the two regimes were tightening military cooperation at a time when Iran is in the process of enriching enough uranium to complete its long-held goal to build a nuclear bomb. Abbas Araghchi, Iran's foreign minister, said that Tehran was open to diplomacy to solve disputes, but not threats and pressure, state media reported on Saturday. The EU is considering new sanctions targeting Iran's aviation sector in reaction to reports Tehran supplied Russia with ballistic missiles in its war against Ukraine. Keir Starmer has been urged by former UK Defence Secretaries and an ex-PM to allow Ukraine to use provided long-range missiles inside Russian territory, even without US backing, according to the Sunday Times. Starmer and Joe Biden held talks in Washington on Friday on whether to allow Kyiv to use the long-range missiles against targets in Russia. No decision was announced. President Biden will use the remaining 4 months of his term to put Ukraine in the best possible position to prevail, according to the US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. Biden would meet Volodymyr Zelensky in late September at the UN General Assembly in New York to discuss aid to Ukraine, Sullivan said. The head of Ukraine's military intelligence agency, the GUR, Kyrylo Budanov, said North Korean military aid to Russia presented the biggest concern on the battlefield compared with support provided by Moscow's other allies. He pointed to the ramp-up in the battlefield hostilities after such deliveries. Senior Russian security official and former president Dmitry Medvedev said on Saturday that Russia could destroy Ukraine's capital Kyiv with non-nuclear weapons in response to the use of Western long-range missiles by Ukraine. Well, the main headline from that was really Sir Keir Starmer's visit to Washington, and it was trailed beforehand that he was going to seek US permission to grant Ukraine the right to fire the Storm Shadow missiles. And as one US commentator said, the US does not invite a UK Prime Minister to Washington to say no. That would be sent through other channels. So I think the key phrase of this is that an agreement was not announced. The Telegraph said it wasn't announced, but it had been agreed. The former Russian Foreign Minister Andrei Kosyrev, who served as Yeltsin's foreign minister, said, "Don't announce it, just fire it." So, Sandra, what's your view on the happenings of the week in Washington and
Well,
Kyiv?
when you mentioned the fact, America seems to be pulling all the strings, basically, and the UK is sort of like just the wagging tail of the dog, basically being told what to do. Biggest worry, I think, for everyone should be that Russia will, declare war against the Western countries. Putin already said that if they allow Ukraine to use, long-range missiles from NATO countries, then he would declare war on the Western countries, which obviously Scotland is right in the middle there. The UK would get hit and Scotland would be basically decimated because we've got trident nuclear weapons just along the road from me in Glasgow. And, all this talk about meeting and, flying out here and flying out there and sanctions against, the various countries, Iran, etc., it's very, very frightening. And you can see from that America, to me, is just desperate to get something, particularly with their elections coming up, desperate to get something that they are the good guys, as I might say, whereas I would call them the most warmongers than anyone else. I worry that you can't trust Stammer, you can't trust him. And I think I said earlier about I'm taking his wee red box with him, the one that you usually use for the budget. Why would you take that in a plane going to meet, Biden and talk about, war with Russia and Ukraine? I think there's something in what perhaps I don't trust the Telegraph, obviously, but I think there is something in that it may be the fact that they have done a deal, and it'd be a very worrying time for the world if they have.
Paul, Sandra's raising the thought there of Putin's so-called red lines. Well, there was a red line that all hell would break loose if Sweden joined NATO, if the West supplied 156 millimeter shells, if F-16s were sent, if Leopard tanks were sent. I mean, all of these have passed. Do we need to take this current red line about striking deep into Russia more seriously than the other ones?
Yeah, I think we do. As Sandra said, I think it's something that Putin's been saying for quite a long time, and we've heard obviously of Russia's proxies, Iran and North Korea, obviously aiding Moscow. I think one of the questions we have to ask is, what's the end game? What's the end game for Russia? What's the end game for America? This war's highly unlikely to be won in terms of we're literally at stalemate and have been for a long period of time. If Russia said it has the capability to melt, and I think these are the words that used Kyiv, then why haven't they done it before? Because they said they had, before the war started, they'd said that they were in that position to do that. So I don't know if this is a negotiating ploy from both either, I suppose, the Western countries, but also Russia. This war is not going to be won. It's not going to be won. And you speak to any military analysts and they will tell you that. So I think it is a worrying time. I think what we should be doing in this is looking in terms of how can this be resolved peacefully. That's not giving in to Russian aggression, but it's got to realise what the realism is of this situation. The war's not going to be won. And as Sandra said, if we do look for a wider war, that could be devastating. And I don't believe anybody wants to go there. But we have to look at what the end game is and trying to move towards the end game. And there are people being killed needlessly, as there are in every war. But this situation is we need to be talking around about how we can get to a peaceful solution. That's not giving in, as I said, to Russian aggression, but it's being realistic in terms of where we are. Most wars are negotiated. They're negotiated to an end. So we've got to look at that, and I would much prefer that's what the US and the UK are talking about. We all know there's backdoor discussions going on in terms of between countries. We've seen the change, the exchange between obviously Russia and Ukraine of 103, I think, soldiers each. So yeah, we should be looking at more than that, and that's where we should be putting the pressure on. And you talk about what's the role of Scotland in this. We've seen the role of Norway, for example, in terms of what it has as a peacemaker. So if they can do it, why not Scotland? But what's the end game and how do we achieve that? War isn't going to be won. It's just not going to be won. And we've seen, I think, Ukraine's excursion into Russia is seen as a negotiating ploy to make sure that they're in a stronger position. But we need to be pushing more on the peace side of things rather than just try to push for war. Nobody's going to win this war.
No. Although I mean, it didn't make the headlines this week so much, but President Zelensky has been pushing for this second peace conference to involve Russia. So perhaps there is some hope to be gained from progress on that. Turning now to Gaza, and at least 41,182 Palestinians have been killed and 95,280 injured in Gaza since 7th of October. Israeli airstrikes across Gaza killed 22 this weekend, while there are reports that a UN worker was killed at his home in the West Bank by an Israeli sniper. As 26-year-old Aysenur Ezgi Egi is buried in Turkey, calls for war crime investigations grow. Now, sadly, this is a story that we have every week on this programme, and there's rarely any good news to report, or indeed any change to report. The one thing, say this week, which is not reported here, and I don't see reported very much at all in the UK or in the US press, is growing demonstrations in Israel, which started off demanding an end to the hostage situation and negotiations, and now have spread more, according to Haaretz and the Times of Israel, to the end of the Netanyahu government and fresh elections, which really is maybe the only way for this to go forward. What do you think, Sandra?
Well, we spoke earlier on just obviously about Ukraine, Russia, Libya, all the rest of it, sanctions against them. I think sanctions stop, the weapons being sold to them. Something's got to come out of that before anything will possibly happen. And we're talking about over 42,000 people killed. I mean, these figures have been disputed by a number of, organisations on the ground, which says it's more likely into the thousands that have been killed. And that's not counting people who are still buried under the rubble. And obviously you've got to mention the West Bank as well. Yeah, I know that we've seen, in Israel, people coming out and demonstrating, but they're not necessarily demonstrating against the genocide. They're demonstrating the fact that they've not got their hostages free. And meanwhile, people and, children are just being murdered day after day after day, horribly disfigured as well. I think we have to get, the UK, well, America, will they do it? I don't know. But they have to put sanctions on Israel. They've broken every international law there is, and they're still continuing with this horrific genocide. And genocide is what it is. They're destroying the whole culture, education, generations of families, and they want to have Gaza and the whole of Palestine to a bigger Israeli state. And we need to look at that bigger picture in that respect. So whilst we can talk, as all the international communities do, nobody's taking any action against Israel, and it's the only thing we can do. I mean, basically, sanctions, BDS, it's got to come forward. Got to stop it selling arms to Israel, or giving them arms even as well. And I think a lot of people in America, when you actually get through to, some of the sites that lets you see what's going on, are waking up to the fact. Because America's, maybe a rich country, but there's an awful lot of poor people in America who are on the streets, who haven't got a job, lots and lots of problems, healthcare, and yet billions of dollars are being sent to Israel. And they're coming to see that fact. So, more basically people being aware of the whole situation, but sanctions has got to come into it. I mean, you can't have Netanyahu going over to America and being welcomed without being arrested when there's an arrest warrant for it. So come on, let's get less of the talk or the judge or whatever you want to call it, and let's see some actual action, which is obviously coincides with the international communities and the ICC saying that these are international war crimes, which they are. We can't watch this. It's the first time I've ever seen anything, and the media are as complicit, not all of the media, but most of it. And then there's a BBC saying that they can't broadcast the International Disaster Committee for monies for Gaza, which they did after a lot of people pushing them after Operation Cast Lead. And they're saying they've not got enough evidence If you're up against that, what chance have the people there got? So come on, let's talk it and let's get some action done and sanction Israel. It's the only way we can go forward with this. Stop the
Paul, yeah,
genocide.
please pick up on what Sandra was saying, but I'm interested particularly, first of all, Turkey calling this week for investigation of a war crime, and Sandra there mentioning numerous war crimes, and of course, genocide. We've seen this too with atrocities in Ukraine, with Russia bombing a cancer hospital, executing civilians in Bucha, blowing up the Kakhovka Dam. Do these international organizations have any power, any muscle, and even the willingness to prosecute war crimes?
I think, first of all, that it's clear the evidence shows that there have been war crimes committed over a period of time, and Israel has been accused of that, and obviously been proven in a number of occasions. And I think that's one thing. Whether they've got the clout or not, again, I think that's debatable. But I think one of the key things that Sandra said as well was obviously around about what can Western countries do, the States and the UK do. And, we're still, you've seen the UK government come out and saying it was stopping some arms sales. That was 10% of the arms sales. So the other 90% is still being sold to Israel. So we should be doing more. We should be banning arms sales to Israel, full stop. We should be looking at sanctions in terms of that, full stop. And, if you try and compare it to pariah states possibly in the past, you've seen when the South African had the apartheid state, the sanctions then as compared to sanctions now, again, is something to look at. But I think there's a number of things as well. The US are obviously the major power broker in this. We've got an election in the States in 7 or 8 weeks where both Harris and Trump are trying to obviously push the pro-Israeli, the pro-Jewish lobby vote as well. So I don't think that helps the situation. And I think in terms of looking at the protests you'd mentioned as well, Netanyahu, if you look at the coalition he has, is politically safe at the moment. He's probably got a majority, about 5 or 6, in the Israeli Knesset. So I think he's politically safe at the moment. So unless that changes and one of his coalition allies pulls out the coalition, you're not going to see a change from Netanyahu. He's had protests against him in the many times that he's been Prime Minister. So again, I think the key thing is, unless one of the coalition allies, who tend to be even more to the right of Netanyahu, pull out, you won't see any change in Netanyahu at all. But the real power broker is obviously the States in terms of arms sales and sanctions. At the moment, I doubt they will change that. But it's genocide, as Sandra said, it's been carried out right in front of our eyes. And it's so sad to see innocent people being killed. And Israel is against a two-state solution. And Sandra mentioned the West Bank. So you're also seeing expansion into the West Bank because they're trying to denigrate any possibility of a two-state solution. So that hence why you're not just seeing in Gaza, but West Bank, where they're trying to take over more and more territory. So this is it's a well-scripted Netanyahu strategy. He'll continue to destroy Gaza as much as he can, and he will continue, obviously, to try and negate whatever land could be left for a two-state solution in the West Bank. We can't forget, obviously, in terms of Hamas's role in this, we can't forget that. There's two sides to this. But in terms of a proportionate response, it's not. It's gone way beyond that, way beyond that.
Okay, thank you both. Turning now to something perhaps a little more light-hearted, although heaven knows it wasn't supposed to be, and that's the US presidential debate. Trump went viral after it, but not in a good way after his "they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats" comments left him open to ridicule and thousands of internet memes. Kamala Harris came over as very presidential and spoke very strongly for women's reproductive rights. You would say in any other election with any other candidates, there would only be one winner, but Trump is a special case in so many, not necessarily good ways. Can Harris come out on top in the swing states and take the election? What do you think, Sandra?
Oh, for me, sorry. Well, I think, what you mentioned by, first of all, started by saying humorous. Basically, it might have been funny to look at, but geez, you've got somebody who, the biggest country in the world, and all the arms, etc., etc., and you're going to have a president who some of the language you use, you wouldn't have used it in a playground even or anything like that. But I had a wee look at these 7 key states, and there's only 4 points of a difference between Kamala Harris and Trump in these key states, according to the analysts that looked at that. So that's pretty tight. And there's another person there who, I don't know whether they don't want to promote her as much, but Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, now she is going to cost, I think, anyway, and some of the press say as well, Kamala Harris a number of votes. She could cost him that because she's the only one that's calling for a ceasefire and an end to genocide. She has a huge following, a voter following in the states which have a large American Muslim contingency, basically. So I think there's that wee part. It's not been looked at as much as I think it should be, because it is neck and neck. I mean, say these seven states basically will be the key states to see who wins, and there's only 4 points in it. And if Jill Stein gets all of these votes from the Muslim Americans, that could cost Harris the election. So I think there's everything to play for in that particular one, and it doesn't get mentioned enough, as far as I'm concerned, about the Green Party candidate who stands for very much, left-wing, liberal, etc., etc. And they're just trying to, badmouth her in the press and all that stuff as well. But I think it's a real threat that Kamala Harris could lose because of Jill Stein, whose policies I think are the absolute correct ones.
Okay, Paul, have you anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Sandra. I do think Kamala Harris will win. I think people will see sense. I think a lot of it is going to depend on the turnout, and I think the key thing is to try and make sure that Kamala Harris gets women voters out who have a slight advantage over male voters in terms of that, and also younger voters who tend to favour Kamala Harris as well. And I think that's going to be the key thing in that regard. So voter registration and obviously getting a number of younger voters, and I said women voters out, is going to be key. But this is much broader than just in terms of cats and dogs and whatever nonsense that Trump comes out. It's almost laughable. You're talking around about what's the future of American democracy. We've heard about, and Trump's denied it, about Project 2025, which is literally talking about limiting democracy. And Trump has the ability to actually move people on from the civil service that don't favour him. So that's extremely worrying. He denies that, but it's very clear he's got a link to that. Roe versus Wade, as you said, is incredibly important. And if Trump comes in terms if he becomes president, you can see abortion being banned in every single state in America. So that's extremely worrying. And when you hear how he talks about immigration, or in regards to that, or refugees, it's xenophobic. It's racist. So there's real worrying times in terms of the states and democracy, and that's before we even go on to his diplomatic disasters in terms of that, where you've got his ex-foreign secretary and his ex-national security advisor saying the man is just a danger. So it's a really, really important election. Hopefully, if Trump loses, that would be the end of his political ambitions. But there's lots at stake in this election coming. And just hope, in 8 weeks, 9 weeks, that we wake up and Kamala Harris is won. I dread to think what would happen if Trump wins. Really do.
Yes, indeed. It's not just an issue for the
Could I
United
come in a wee
States.
tiny
It's for
bit?
the whole world.
Could I come in a wee tiny bit, Douglas?
Yeah,
Sorry,
sure.
just to pick up something that was said there. I mean, we know what Trump's like in regards to immigration, right wing, etc., etc. But we have to remember, we had our own Trump here, not just Boris Johnson, but Farage, the Reform Party, and that is a worry throughout the world that the right is, the countries are swinging to the right. So I mean, I don't want Trump to win, obviously, but I think these factions, you've got to look at all of these factions to see, because I think there's a real danger that Kamala Harris won't win. Sorry, thank you.
Yes, we shall see in time. But it has been a traditional thing in the UK to first mock America and then copy it. So let's hope that's not the case. So turning now to Westminster and the vote this week on the winter fuel payments. This week, the UK Labour government won a vote on withdrawing pensioners' winter fuel allowance by 348 votes to 228, with 53 Labour MPs not voting. Only one Labour MP voted against the whip, and all of the Scottish Labour MPs voted for the cuts to winter fuel allowance, which will affect 860,000 pensioners in Scotland. Ireland has announced that Irish pensioners will receive €1,000 winter fuel payment. And of course, that's on top of the announcement that Electric Ireland made about a week ago that the price of electricity and gas in Ireland would fall in October. Add to the information there that the 860,000 pensioners in Scotland will be affected. The news which the DWP released on Friday evening of all times that 71% of disabled pensioners will be affected by this. Sandra, I'm sure you want to vent your anger, first of all, into the Scottish Labour MPs, but I'd like you also to have some thoughts on what can Scotland do about this.
Well, I was going to perhaps ask Paul to come in because obviously it affects, the monies that we were going to give to pensioners in the Scottish Parliament. And I thought maybe he might have some inside knowledge in that. So I don't know if that's all right, but I thought because Paul is the elected member, I thought maybe he would have a wee bit of inside knowledge of what's happening in the Scottish Parliament, because there's obviously, we're getting attacked on it, so I don't know what's going on inside. So sorry.
Well, housing is part of social care now, so spill the beans then, Paul.
No, Sandra, you're right. I mean, and I think the First Minister's talked about it, as has the CabSec, in terms of this. We were given no notice this was going to happen at all. There was going to be the devolved powers to ourselves, and that was ready to go. We were told that this was happening. We weren't told this was happening. It would have been between 160 to 180 million pounds that the Scottish Government would have to have found in terms of that. And as Sandra knows, in terms of that, we can't. So the money would have to have been found from elsewhere. And as Sandra knows, we can't raise any taxes or do anything else at that particular during a term time. It has to be. It's the only time you can change that is at the budget. So we can't. In already extremely challenging financial positions due to Westminster, we couldn't find 180 million pounds. So, there's a couple of things. One, I think it's a complete disrespect to devolution. In terms of that, and the so-called new relationship, I didn't think of to a start yet, and yet we see Ian Murray being handed £150 million war chest, if you like, to try and spend over the heads of the Scottish Government. So it put us in an impossible position. And what makes it worse is there was no analysis carried out in terms of what the impact would have, and we all know that Scotland is colder, and just this week. Just in September, we've seen snow in the Cairngorms. So, that it's completely disrespectful to Scotland. It put us in an impossible position in terms of that. And as you said, I can compare it to just look what Ireland have done. It's just, there's the power of an independent country being able to do what it does, runs a budget surplus, and is looking after its most vulnerable people. We have the UK government here in a ridiculous position of cutting it to the most vulnerable people, and not one Labour MP. And you've heard very few Labour MSPs talking about this. They all promised before the election to stand up for Scotland, and it proves yet again that they don't. They're told what to do by a UK Prime Minister.
Yeah, Sandra, if you can pick
Yes.
up on that, and particularly the position of Labour MPs in Scotland. As Paul said, there were all these promises before the election of standing up for Scotland, and the fuel bills would go down. And then the winter fuel allowance was one of the first debates in the new Parliament. And I got the impression that the Labour strategy was, well, we'll get this bad news out now and it'll blow over. But it hasn't blown over. It's become huge. So is it going to run and run, and is it going to really damage Labour in Scotland?
Well, it should run and run, and as the weather gets cold, I mean, I've got a jumper on today, which is the first time I've had to put a jumper on, basically, during the day anyway, so you know how cold it is getting. But in a political point of view, Labour, the mitigation situation, they've been very smart on this, and they've been liars as well, very smart on this fact. But as Paul has pointed out, we had budgeted what it was going to cost, and we were supposed to be getting that money. and then they just pull the rug from under your feet. And they're going to do that with everything. So we have to keep this running in that respect, to make sure that the blame lies where it does lie, and that's Westminster. Can't step back from it. But in a purely public point of view, or a point of view even from myself, who obviously is affected by this, basically, I mean, it's a universal, I wouldn't even call it a benefit, because we've all paid into it, paid our taxes, everything. We've all paid into it anyway. Tried to do that with the pensions as well. And they always said you couldn't means test it because of the bureaucracy would cost too much money. Now all of a sudden, they're not means testing, they're just taking it away, and you've got a document of 230 pages, I think it is, if you want to fill it in. But nothing was done, as Paul had already said, I think you said yourself as well, Douglas, to look at the fact that how is this going to affect people? And now we've got the DWP's paper out on it, telling you that, funny, I'm not saying funny enough, but it was talking about it will affect couples more. I was assuming it might affect single people more, not getting this money, couples more, and men will be more affected, and people on lower incomes, which we absolutely know that's going to happen. So if you're on pension credits, you will get X, Y, and Z, as we all know. But if you're just above that, you're going to lose that money, and you're not able to get any other pension credits. So I think it's something that really needs to run, and this other part seems to have been forgotten about. If you're lucky enough to live in Spain or live abroad, and you get your pension paid over there, you're getting the full allowance. I mean,
Yes.
that should be something that's raised constantly all the time. Here's people that are living there, bought their house over there, and good on them if they get a nice bit of sunshine. They're lucky, basically, but they're getting the winter fuel allowance, which we here, in the UK, let's look at it in the round, in the UK, Scotland in particular, where it's really cold, it's coming off us. It just doesn't make sense. It's a cruel, cruel thing to do. And then they're talking about, well, they're even talking about maybe taking away the concessionary fares. I'd like to see how that pans out in regards, and I'll push that to Paul. Maybe he'll raise it in the Scottish Parliament, because obviously that's devolved to us. So I'd like to see how that would pan out about the
Yeah,
concessionary
that's
fare.
one we'll turn to in a future program, I'm sure. But I
Oh,
would like to.
sorry, I'm right.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'd like to say with issues in Scotland, and on Wednesday, Petro Ineos announced the closure of the Grangemouth oil refinery in 2025. Now, what can the Scottish and UK governments do to secure the future for the workers and the plant? So, if I turn to you, Paul, first, being part of the current government now, I know that Hannah Bardell had found this company, North American company, who might be interested in buying it, and I understand that talks are ongoing in government, and I know if you do know about it, obviously you can't reveal the details of that. But I mean, is this a likely strategy? Finding a buyer, is that the way forward for Grangemouth? Do you think?
I think there's a number of things. Just on Friday, a number of us were invited, and this is both from UK government and Scottish government. I think it was Gillian Martin and Michael Shanks had hosted a meeting with MSPs who were relatively close to the area, so that had a number of people. And I have to say that both governments are working, and acknowledge that, are working closely together on this. So I think that was, and that's good to see. I think it needs to be, because there are still obviously some powers that are held to the UK government in terms of that. I think there's a number of options being looked in terms of what the options are for the site as it goes forward. Looking at low carbon usage. So again, but that's not going to turn around overnight. I think Michelle Thompson had also indicated that she'd been speaking to a company that who she thinks is interested in the site and taking on the site. She didn't go into detail, and I think that we'll see where discussions go in terms of that. So I think it's Project Willow, it's called, in terms of what are the options for the site going forward. But I think the ball is in Petronas' court, in terms of that. They have to be the company that have to sell, and they obviously have to think, what are the options in terms of that. So I know there's possibly a number of interested buyers. I'm not aware of the details, and that might just be a very senior level within Scottish Government. But I know both governments are working very closely together at the moment, but we've got to think, there's 400 and odd workers that could lose their job next year. So, let's hope that if there are interested buyers, we can firm up on that, and we can see what we can do in terms of that. I think there's also, I suppose, a roundabout picture on this as well. There's the Grangemouth as well. There's a kind of a chemical industry around about that, which again has the potential to grow. So what are the retraining opportunities around about that? So there's a lot of things to consider. Are there interested buyers? How can we expand the potential of looking at the other chemical, smaller kind of companies around about Grangemouth itself? How can we make sure that expands as well? And both governments need to keep on working close together. I know there's a lot happening just about every day at the moment in terms of this. So but the ball, as I said, in Petro Ennis's court. But we have the situation. The longer, we have a situation, we won't have a refinery in Scotland. One of the highest oil producers in Europe, and we won't have a refinery. And that's where it comes down again. If we want to take this back to the powers of independence, we don't have the ability to do anything about that either. And it's a ridiculous position to be in. We won't have a refinery in oil-rich Scotland. Now, we can have this debate around about the future of renewables as against the oil use of oil, and that's another debate totally. But the fact that we wouldn't have a refinery, and it's not, it's just a ridiculous position to be in. But let's hope we can get a buyer. Let's hope we can get a future for Grangemouth, not just for Scotland, but obviously more importantly for the people who actually work there and their families. So, but I know there's lots of discussions going on at the moment in terms of that I'm not fully party to. That's obviously, I think the First Minister's been up there as well, and Gillian Martin, Energy Minister's Cabinet Secretary, is working very closely with the UK government on this as well. So, and they're working closely with, I think they're both acknowledged they're working well together on this.
So. Sandra, a good news story of cooperation between the UK and the Scottish government, which has not been happening of late, but vitally important for Grangemouth. There's not. Well, I suppose the school child, it was a totem of Scottish industry.
I don't trust them. I mean, I know that, I think Paul mentioned slightly on it, we'll probably go on to later on with the green strategy one. Basically, I mean, obviously we were moving to, a much greener, environment, etc., etc. And we were talking about Grangemouth being a 2 to 3 year transition period. And obviously the 400 workers that are there, very experienced, they would be transitioned into other jobs. And then all of a sudden, this, I call it sheer vandalism by the UK government, past and present, to say, right, okay, this is nothing to do with us, and then to give the owner of the owner of Grangemouth money's enough to go and set up somewhere in Belgium, basically, and then it's just quite unbelievable. And then the other thing which I find is a slap in the face for the workers and for the Scottish people as well, that they're talking about they will set up an import depot in Grangemouth for products that are coming from other parts of the world, oil products, and it would be stored in Grangemouth. I mean, how come that? I mean, that's like a sheer slap in the face in regards to it. And I think we really need to play hard on this particular one. We need to go in there shouting. I think I don't trust the UK government. This is already like a done deal, and we need to make as much noise as possible. If we can stop basically this happening, it would be great. But I don't like to use the word hope, because I just don't trust the UK government at all. We should be coming in hard, and can we stop the monies? Well, the money's already went in here, right enough. But there has to be something that we can do. Otherwise, we're as well just saying, well, what is the point? What's the point of having a parliament if the only oil-producing country, or the major oil-producing country, doesn't have a refinery? Just doesn't make sense. Vandalism by the UK governments.
Okay, thank you. And I'm sure this is something which will come up in all our evening news programmes during the week on Broadcasting Scotland. But you trail that quite nicely with the industrial strategy, Sandra. So this week, the Scottish Government launched what it described as a focused strategy to place Scotland at the forefront of the net zero economy. For those who didn't follow it, there were five priorities. I would say that three of them were physical, so to concentrate on Scotland's wind power generation, on carbon capture, and the third one to expand the hydrogen network, and then on the economic side of it to have a green energy focus in the economy and to prioritise investment in that area. Now, if you're the finance minister or the energy minister of a sovereign independent state, you're rubbing your hands in glee. You think, I've got all this money. I mean, with the economic part of it is quite easy because it's financed by the power generation, but not so easy in a devolved country where the purse strings are held at Westminster and energy policy is also dictated at Westminster. So how's it going to work, Paul?
And I think first of all, the green industrial strategy is a good step forward. But you're right; it's within its limitations that we have as a devolved country. We don't have power, as you said, over energy regulation. I think that's incredibly important. And I think it was just on that you'd seen. I think it was the owner of Octopus Energy had come out and said, Scotland could be in a position that it could have the cheapest energy prices in Europe, but we don't have the ability to do that. We have the opposite. I think the Green Industrial Strategy does recognise the strong strategic importance and strength that Scotland has. I mean, I've had the pleasure of visiting the Freeport up in Nig and Ardashir and so on, and the opportunities up there are fantastic, absolutely fantastic. It also brings its challenges. I've got to make sure, as Housing Minister, we're building houses to make sure that we cover the growth in population that'll be there. So we're working very closely with them, the likes of SSEN, for example, also on that. But taxation goes down to UK government. We don't have the ability to set energy regulation, so we don't have the benefits of seeing the cheaper fuel coming through as well. So it will create jobs, which is great. It will bring some wealth to Scotland, which is great. It'll bring investment to Scotland, which is great. But we don't have the full powers of an independent country to make sure that our people get the benefits of that. And that's the really, for me, that's a really frustrating part. And it comes back to what we're saying about Ireland, who have nowhere near the energy boost that we have. But it can give monies back to the pensioners and it's most vulnerable to look after them for winter fuel and so on. So it's a great opportunity, but it's frustrating also in terms of where it kind of leaves us. And again, I think we're all working very closely. Scottish Government are working very closely talking about the opportunities, for example, around about hydrogen. And I think there are great opportunities around about hydrogen as well, which could bring us that benefit. But we will see jobs, we will see some investment, but we don't see the other benefits, such as I said, as cheaper fuel prices and so on, because we don't have the powers, which is really frustrating.
Sandra, Paul used the word frustrated at least 3 times in his answer there. I'm sure
yes, I could use more and more and more.
I think, to be fair, I think that's been the mood of Scotland since after the referendum. I really think that has been the mood. And 10 years passed, and okay, we're going to talk about that as well, so I won't get into it. But I think people are very, very frustrated, and I hate to use the word frustration. I'll go into the strategy and I'll say it's a very ambitious strategy. It looks great on paper. As I said previously, I don't trust the UK government, whatever they are, colour they are, red or blue, basically. And my mind casts back to, this was actually in 2014, this was introduced, the ACON project, if you remember correctly, in Peterhead, where we could do the carbon capture. It was almost ready, it was ready to be used, and then the UK government pulled it from under our feet. And this came about in 2014, and they said that this would happen and we would have all these jobs, etc., etc. And then, of course, if you vote no in 2014, you would get all this for you. And then as soon as the result came out, they pulled it. So I have no confidence in a UK government. And we were ready for this carbon capture. We were the right place for it up in Peterhead. We had all the various partners there ready to work with us, with the Scottish Government. And then they refused to give the monies to let it go ahead. So whilst it's a great, very ambitious strategy, we really need to look we've got an ambitious strategy. We've got these, you know, stuff put in place that we can't get over this particular wall. We need to have a strategy in place, Scottish Government, that we can look at how can we do anything like that. I mean, can we can we give powers to local councils perhaps that could go ahead and do X, Y and Z? I mean, it's ridiculous that, I mean, I work with a charity and we're putting solar panels in, and if we have too much electricity for our solar panels, we can sell it back to the grid. But here we have a country, a government that can't do that. We need to look at different things at how we're going to manage, because we're not independent yet. So we need to look at various aspects of how we're going to do that to make sure that we get some control over it. And we can talk all we like, but this strategy, yeah, absolutely brilliant. But you're putting your faith in a UK government that has their finger in every pie. So let's have something, a group, which we did have before, I don't know if we've still got it, that looks at various parts where we do have powers, and can we put powers down to local councils? They've got more powers than the Scottish Parliament, for instance. So that's where I come in this one. And I know that, Paul, you mentioned free ports. Well, I've got questions about them as well, particularly what happened down south, where two guys picked it up for £1 and they're millionaires now. So I would like to have a wee look more at free ports, about the benefits and whether we keep these benefits or whether that's getting siphoned off once again to the Treasury or individuals. So I think there's a lot to look in this. It's great. We can say it's wonderful, and I'll give it 100 ticks. But how's it going to evolve? That's where I want to find out.
Okay, before we move on, let's give Paul the opportunity to comment on what you're saying about free ports.
I don't.
Sandra, happy to pick that up. Yeah, I think you're right. There was concerns within, I suppose, within the independence movement and around about that. I think the opportunity that it brings, and the model up in Scotland is different to the model that was down south. It's going to bring opportunities for jobs. It's going to bring opportunities around about new housing. Just the point that you made as well, Sandra, I think there's a couple of things. One, the Scottish Government will be bringing out its broader energy strategy very soon, which again looks at opportunities around about that. But again, we're kind of hamstruck by energy regulation being looked after in the UK. Still reserved. I think there's obviously the opportunities looking at the whole retrofitting agenda in terms of that. How do we make our buildings more airtight in terms of that, and also looking into the opportunities with that, where some local authorities can have more powers over that, but the powers are still held energy-wise by London. So.
Yes, but why can't we push for a second grid? Why have we always got to send it down? And I'm not the only person that said this. There's been experts have spoken about. Yeah. In fact, a chap from Octopus Energy said there should be a north grid, not just one down the south. So why can't we push some for that?
Sandra, there's a new Eastern Link.
I'm not blaming you, I'm just asking.
No, and I think you're right in terms of having the ability, as a devolved country, the cost of that would be difficult. We have restricted borrowing powers in terms of that. And you're right, 5 miles down the road from me, we're building an Eastern Link, which is literally connecting Scotland to England.
Yes.
In terms of that, and we get no benefits, from that. So,
an individual,
again, I see that literally just down the road from me. So.
Yeah,
but again, this is all down to the powers we've got over energy,
etc. But a country can't do it. There must be something in between these pieces of regulations. Why don't we just make the Scottish Parliament a social enterprise then, and then we could get the electricity? Why not?
Well, I think plenty of ideas there, Sandra.
That way.
We will come back to energy, I'm sure, in future programmes, and have. There are plenty of energy experts have appeared on this programme and have spoken about things like regional pricing, which covers the octopus point. So we will return to that. But it all, of course, ties into this week, as everyone on watching this programme will be aware, is the 10th anniversary of the independence referendum. Okay, so 10 years after, how did the no vote turn out for Scotland? Well, we were promised strength in the union. Scotland was too poor. Its energy capabilities would run out. We would be protected by being in the European Union, and so on and so on. What has it meant? And more importantly, where does Scotland go from here? Sandra, do you want to
Me.
kick off?
But
Literally.
me, gosh, I wish I had the answer to that $1 million question. One of the things that, as I say, I went to the rally yesterday because I thought it was important to have as many people there as possible. And the one thing that really struck me was, I mean, you mentioned it when you started there, Douglas, too wee, too poor, etc., etc. And everybody, there were good speakers on the stage, don't get me wrong, there were good speakers, but it was all negative, negative. That's the way I felt. It was always blaming this, blaming Westminster, which I do a lot as well. And there was nothing that gave hope, even though it was supposed to be hope over fear, or aspiration. That's certainly what I felt, and a couple of people I was with felt the same. So we've got to start building up the network we had in the lead up to the Yes campaign, which was absolutely fantastic. And the reason it was fantastic was because there was hope and there was aspiration and there was confidence that we could do it. Now we've got to get over the media, etc., because they have just completely, come right down on us, and a lot of confidence is going away. I know a number of young couples who are deciding they're going to leave Scotland because they can't afford to live here, believe it or not. And it's true, lots of people can. So we have to get the aspirations and the positivity back into this movement. We can't continue just blaming people all the time, and then looking at new ways, as we were talking about there, about energy, etc., whatever it may be, and coming out with new ideas. That's something. Where we go, we can talk about doing all this, but the worry about me is, do we go cap in hand again to Westminster? Do we say we want another, Section 34, go to the Supreme Court, whatever? That's not work, it's not going to work. So we need to have a strategy where we bypass that. Do we go to the international courts? There's nobody. I remember the wee blue book. I think lots of people probably remember that, which was fantastic. People picked up at bus stops, on buses, sitting in seats, very concise, put it in your pocket. We need to get the feeling back, the positivity back that we had before that, and get the people engaged. That to me is the only way. But we can't do that unless we can say to them, this is what we're going to do. And we've never come up with an answer yet. Never come up with an answer after all these years. I'm not an expert, I'm just a punter. So I would like somebody to come up with this answer. Do we go to the International Court? Do we re-challenge the Supreme Court? Because, when you look at what they said, it was an absolute political decision. They said that the reason they couldn't let us have another referendum because it was politically detrimental to the UK. If that's not political, and a Supreme Court shouldn't be political, personally I would have said, I'm going to challenge that on the language itself, but we didn't, and that's passed. So we need to have an answer for the people before they'll come out in the droves, the thousands that they came out before.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, Sandra, and the mention of a referendum. So turning to you, Paul, I was struck by John Swinney's speech at National Conference. There's a lady from Sky doing a piece to camera beside me, and she said, he still aiming for a referendum. He never mentioned the word referendum once in his speech. And I noticed in the speech earlier this week that referendum was not mentioned. And he had said, we spent too much time arguing about process. So is there another route to independence? And also, Sandra was talking about inspiring people. I was reading Stuart MacDonald's piece in The Scotsman on Saturday and talking about a new zeitgeist. Well, yeah, great. And then the main thrust of it was, lower tax for middle income. Not many people are going to disagree with that, but it's not going to have people, as you say, sitting on the bus, jumping up and down with enthusiasm. So, what's the way forward?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a number of things, and as we approach 10 years, I think we all have memories of that. And mine was, it was my daughter's first vote. She was 16 and voted that. And I remember myself, my wife, my son, my daughter the night before thinking, we're on the brink of achieving independence, and then the following day finding that we didn't. I remember my son, who was in George Square that night thinking we had won and phoning
We did.
about 3 o'clock in the morning in tears, absolutely devastated. And it took weeks to get over that, and it still hurts now, really hurts now. I think in terms of the things that we've been talking about today, energy, foreign policy, anything, the EU, things we've been talking about. If you had an independent analyst or independent to have saying what's improved for Scotland since 2014 in terms of these areas, nothing, absolutely nothing. I think the key thing, and I think I can see both points. We need process is important, of course it is. But we need to make sure that we're convincing people that independence is the best way to go ahead. It's not just a concept. What difference does it actually make to them in their life? Obviously, the SNP had its difficulties in the last number of months, and we need to get our act together in terms of that. And John Swinney, I think, is doing a good job in terms of that, and the party seems much more united. It's more focused in terms of that. We have a manifesto in 2026 we need to prepare for it. We need to be more radical in terms of that and look what it's actually impacting on people's lives just now, making sure we've got the answers to that. So we have to make sure that we're persuading people. And this has always been, the hardest part is persuading people that the future for them, the best future for them in terms of their families, in terms of the best future for Scotland is independence. So we've got to focus in on that. The process is important as well. But our key fundamental job should be we need to persuade more people of the powers of independence, of what they can do to impact on their life. And I still remember in 2014 being at the polling station that day, and a number of young kids, like my daughter, who was 16 at that time, coming through, and just about every single one of them was supporting independence. Was just it's something that will live with me. Until we get our independence, it's something that will live with me. The number of young kids, because they thought that independence was their way ahead to give them a better future, will always live with me, and it pushes me on in terms of that. But we need to make sure that people realise the benefits of independence, and that's a challenge to every single one of us, not just in the SNP but in the independence movement. And we're now seeing that the blue Tories haven't worked. The red Tories aren't worked as well. They aren't working. We've seen them attacking the most vulnerable. The 2-child cap, they all said they would turn over. They went a fuel allowance and said they wouldn't go down there. Now we're talking around about, as you said, attacking other areas, council tax reductions, for example. And we'll see at the end of October with the Labour budget that the red Tories aren't going to make the most vulnerable people better off in our society. It's the same wasted policies that haven't worked. And the UK is a busted flush. Just look at the debt figures that they're in at the moment. The OBR came out during the week and literally said the UK is, it's unsustainable. It's unsustainable. But our job is to make sure we persuade people of all ages, whether it's aspiration, whether it's protecting the most vulnerable, that independence is the best way ahead for them. And when we look at 10 years ago to compare it to now, our case is even stronger. But we need to make sure we're persuading more people to do that. And I'm like Sandra, we will get our independence. I'm convinced we will get our independence. We've got a long way to go, but we need to be persuading more people that's the best way ahead for Scotland.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure we could continue speaking about this for the next hour, but that's it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated, and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Right now, we urgently need to increase our donations if we are to be able to pay our bills. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but only receive donations of around £2,500. Please donate whatever you can afford. So thank you very much today to our guests, Sandra White and to Paul McLennan, for giving up part of your Sunday to the programme. And thank you to you at home for watching. Goodbye. Thank you for watching. Enjoy your Sunday, and please join us on Broadcasting Scotland through the week. From me, goodbye for now.